Welcome to Philosophy 101, the introduction to philosophy. Throughout the course of this semester, we're going to be looking at various philosophical concepts and delving into and studying a survey of various thought patterns or thought processes that people have had down through the history of philosophy. We're primarily going to concern ourselves with the Western tradition. However, we will delve also a little bit into the Eastern. But, from the time that we're young, and we hear the term philosopher, probably the first thing that comes to mind is somebody who is sort of secluded themselves away in an ivory tower, poring over dusty tomes of study for years on end, who, when they try to speak to people, speak in a language that is arcane and esoteric, that is elevated above anything that we normal humans might be able to understand or comprehend. However, I think that's a misunderstanding of what philosophy is. You see, everybody has a philosophy. Everybody operates off of what might be known as a worldview. Now, a worldview, according to philosopher Ronald Nash, a worldview is the sum total of the answers that you and I give to the most important questions in life. The sum total of the answers that you and I give to the most important questions in life. You and I both have a worldview. Everyone has a worldview. And a worldview basically answers the questions about our place in the universe and answers the questions about good or bad. At least it addresses those. A worldview, for example, might be our assumptions, the answers that we give as to, for example, what is at the very bottom of all reality? What is most real at the end of the day? What is the universe made of? What am I as a human being made of? Why am I here? What is good and what is bad? And how can we know anything at all? What is knowledge? What does it mean to know anything? Now, these are questions that we probably don't address too much in the course of everyday life, but these are questions that we all assume an answer to. If I ask you how you know a certain thing to be true, you will probably have an answer ready for me. Maybe it's because you saw it. Maybe it's because you reasoned it with your mind. Maybe you know something to be true because somebody told you. But your worldview it's the answer to how you know what you know. Your worldview is your answer to what you believe to be most fundamentally real in the world. Your worldview answers questions like, what do I believe is good and bad? How should I act as a person? How should I act in relationship to others? How should I carry on my relationships? Everybody has a worldview. And a worldview is derived directly from the questions that philosophy asks. And so every one of us does philosophy, but not every one of us does philosophy well. And so the study of philosophy really is intended to be a study that enriches your life and helps you address those questions so that you can have a more consistent worldview, so that you can see what the implications of your worldview are, and so that you can follow through on those implications. So what is it then that philosophers study? What is it that will help us develop this most important aspect of ourselves? What is it that will help us in our recognition of and development of our worldview? Well, here are a few things that philosophers study, and we want to start off this semester just by giving a really high-level, broad introduction to some of the topics that later on we're going to delve a little bit more deeply into. But for the purposes of this particular talk, we're going to look at what do philosophers study. The first field of study that philosophers often delve into, and it's first in terms, I believe, of its direct application to the rest of the field of philosophy. It's not actually the first question that philosophers got to in the history of philosophy, but the first field that we'll look at is the study of logic. The study of logic. Now, every question that we ask, whether it be a question of how do we know what we know, whether it be a question of what is good and what is evil, every question that we know and every question that we're going to address in the study of philosophy presupposes an underlying assumption that we can know something about the world, that we can use reason and logic in order to know something about the world. And so it would be good for us to take a look at the study of logic. So what is the study of logic? Well, the study of logic is the study of right reasoning. The study of logic is the study of right reasoning. Did you know that there is a right way to think and a wrong way to think? Did you know that there's a right way to think and a wrong way to think? What would you do? What would you say if I told you that? I'll let it pause for just a moment. Let that sink in, that there's a right way to think and a wrong way to think. Well, sort of in our culture, in our worldview, which is more or less steeped in a view that's called relativism, the idea of someone asserting that there's a right way to think and a wrong way to think kind of runs counterintuitive to many people. In fact, for some it might offend. But just think for a moment, if we were sitting across the table with one another and I told you that there's a right way to think and a wrong way to think, and you responded to me, that's not true. Everybody has their own way of thinking, and no one person is more right or more wrong than the other. Just think of what was just said there. The person who is advocating that every way is true, the person that is advocating that there's not a right way to think and a wrong way to think, has just told me that I'm wrong, has just assumed the truth of what I said. They've assumed that I'm wrong and my way of thinking is wrong. My way of thinking that says that there's a right way to think and a wrong way to think is wrong. And their way of thinking that everybody is equal is right. But they've just told me that I'm wrong, which assumes my way, what I've just said. You see, that's what logic does. Logic is a systematized set of rules by which we think, and we cannot think outside of those, not rationally anyway. We cannot violate the law of logic and then be able to communicate at all. The laws of logic are called or known as the laws of logic because you cannot break them or you cannot argue against them without invoking them first. The laws of logic are such that you cannot argue against them without invoking them. So let's take a look at a couple of the laws of logic. And this is unfortunately a very brief introduction. Neither the book nor this course allows for an in-depth study of logic, but there is a course available if you'd like to take that elsewhere in Ivy Tech. But a couple of the laws of logic, starting out. First of all, the law of identity. The law of identity. And the law of identity simply says a thing is what it is. We might phrase this as A equals A. A thing is what it is. Now I know that sounds super profound, right? A thing is what it is. But consider for a moment what that implies. That implies that there's actually real meaning behind things. That words are symbols, right? So we can use different words to describe the same object. Indeed, every different language has a different word for dog, for example. And those words are symbols, but the meaning behind that symbol is something that we all share. So whether I'm from France, or whether I'm from China, or whether I'm from Uganda, or whether I'm from Canada, and you could take a person from each one of those places with their respective languages, their differing respective languages. They could look at the same object, and though they had a different word for that object, they all had the same meaning for that object. So the meaning is something behind the word, it's behind the symbol. And that meaning is what that object is. So there's a law of identity that things actually have meaning, that words actually point to things with meaning and so forth. A thing is what it is. Now, how would you argue against that? Would you tell me that words really don't have meaning? Well, how would you tell me that? Well, you would have to use words to tell me that words don't have meaning. But if words don't have meaning and you use words to tell me that words don't have meaning, what have you really said? You see, you have to assume the law of identity in order to even argue against the law of identity, which is a good indication that the law of identity is sound. Well, moving on from there's not only the law of identity, there's also the law of non-contradiction. The law of non-contradiction. And the law of non-contradiction says that a thing cannot be both itself and not itself at the same time and in the same way. A thing cannot be both itself and not itself at the same time and in the same way. A cannot equal both A and non-A at the same time in the same sense. This would be saying, for example, let's say that I had a red ball in my hand, and I said, this red ball is blue. Well, it can't be both red and blue in the same time and in the same sense. Because red and blue are contradictions of one another. They're not the same thing. And so the object cannot be both red and blue at the same time in the same sense. Now, some people might say, well, what if it was half red and half blue? Then it could be both red and blue. Yes, that's true, but understand the second part of that, right? So it cannot be red in the same way that it is blue, and it cannot be blue in the same way at the same time that it is red. There can be no contradiction in reality. In the world that we live in, there can be no contradiction. Contradictions only exist abstractly. They don't exist in reality. In a similar way that we saw with the law of identity, you cannot argue against the law of non-contradiction without invoking the law of non-contradiction. Because to say that the law of non-contradiction is false is basically saying that the reason that the law of non-contradiction doesn't stand is because it contradicts reality. And you invoke the law of non-contradiction to say that the law of non-contradiction contradicts reality. You invoke it in order to try to argue against it. Therefore, again, it's very, very indicative of the fact that the law of non-contradiction is sound. Now, the third law of logic that we use in the classical study of logic is what is known as the law of the excluded middle. And again, this is related back to the law of non-contradiction, the law of the excluded middle. And the law of the excluded middle says that either a thing is true or it is false. And if we're dealing with statements, a statement is either true or false. It cannot be both. There cannot be a middle ground between it. Because when you go trying to find a middle ground, what you've done is you have actually changed the proposition. So, for example, if I say that God exists or God does not exist, God cannot partially exist. God either has to exist or to not exist. God cannot partially exist. There can be no middle ground on that. Now, obviously, it's going to do, what we mean by God is going to have to take into consideration, and in that definition has to stay true across both statements, has to stay the same rather. And then what we mean by to exist has to stay the same. That definition has to stay the same across definitions. But on the one hand, if we have the statement that God exists, on the other hand, the statement that God does not exist, there can be no middle ground between the two. One is true or the other. There cannot be a middle ground, because a middle ground would constitute a new statement that then would have to be compared or contrasted versus what it implies. So anyway, the law of identity, the law of non-contradiction, the law of the excluded middle, these are laws of logic that frame our thinking, and we cannot escape them without assuming them. So that would argue for the fact that they are sound laws of logic. Now, also in logic, we have what's known as a syllogism. And this is getting into a little bit with our logical argumentation. And a syllogism is a basic logical argument where the conclusion follows necessarily from the premise. A syllogism is a basic logical argument where the conclusion follows necessarily from the premise. Now, let me back up a little bit. I kind of skipped over this. But when we talk in philosophy about an argument, please don't have in mind the idea of two people sort of screaming at the top of their lungs at one another and going head to head. That's not the kind of argument that we're talking about when we talk about a logical argument. A logical argument is simply debating the truth or falsity of different premises or different claims, different propositions. And a syllogism is a form of argumentation. It's a basic logical argument where the conclusion follows necessarily from the premises. Let's give an example here of an argument, of a logical argument that could be used. A classical example of this would be this argument. Premise number one would say that all men are mortal. All men are mortal. Premise two would be Socrates is a man. And the conclusion to that would be what? It would be, therefore, Socrates is mortal. So all men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. That is the conclusion that we derive from that syllogism. And what you notice on that syllogism, if you look at the syllogism there, what you notice is that premise one, all men are mortal, starts off by asserting a universal, something that is true about all men, a universal set. Philosophers call this a distributed term. Premise two, your minor premise there, moves from the universal to the particular. And it says something, it hones in on one specific example of a man. In this case, the man is Socrates, an individual, one specific or particular individual. Socrates is a man, and all men are mortal. Therefore, we can know something about Socrates if we know that he is a man, and if we know that all men are mortal. We can know that Socrates is immortal. We move from a universal set to a particular example of that universal set, and then we can move to a conclusion. Okay? That is a syllogism. And this is a basic syllogism. Syllogisms can be more complex than this, but this is a basic syllogism. Though this type of argumentation might seem to be quite simple, it is very possible to go wrong in a syllogism. When someone goes wrong in a syllogism, this is called a fallacy of logic. It's a fallacy of logic. A fallacy of logic is where where mistakes are made in a syllogism that renders the syllogism either invalid or false. And those are technical terms. We'll get at that just a little bit later. But a fallacy of logic is where you have mistakes that are made in the argumentation that either renders it invalid or false. For example, there can be two different kinds of fallacies. There can be formal fallacies and there can be informal fallacies. Formal fallacies are mistakes that are made that are related to the form of the argument itself. Now, you recall a moment ago when we talked about moving from a universal set to a particular example of that universal set, and then to a conclusion, right? Well, that is the form of the argument, a universal to a particular to the conclusion. And it's possible to mess that up. And if you mess that up, then you have what's known as a formal fallacy. As an example of this, consider the following argument. Some men have brown eyes. Pat has brown eyes. Therefore, Pat is a man. Some men have brown eyes. Pat has brown eyes. Therefore, Pat is a man. There's a problem with the form of this argument. For example, on premise one, we see that some men have brown eyes, and maybe that's true. In fact, I know it is true. I'm a man and I have brown eyes myself. Premise two says Pat has brown eyes, and let's take for the sake of argument, let's just assume that Pat does have brown eyes. The conclusion from that argument is that Pat is a man. And it may very well be that Pat is a man. But this argument doesn't actually prove it. Why not? Why not? Well, because premise number one, we start off with, premise number one, it says some men have brown eyes. And that's undoubtedly true. But what we need to say is, but you notice that this is a particular term. It says some men. It doesn't refer to all men, something that is true of all men. And if it's true of just some men, then Pat, even if he is a man, Pat may be a part of that group of men who this doesn't apply to, right? So you cannot move from a particular to a particular and prove anything about that particular. That is a formal fallacy. Now, when an argument has a formal fallacy in it, then that argument is what we call invalid. Invalid. An argument with a formal fallacy is invalid. Now, again, the conclusion could be true, but this argument doesn't prove the conclusion. This argument only states three facts that are independent of one another. So that is a formal fallacy. Now, it's also possible to have what's known as an informal fallacy. And an informal fallacy is where you have a problem with the argument that is not related to the form of the argument that renders it unsound. The problem with an argument that has an informal fallacy is that sometimes those arguments can be valid and therefore they can look good or sound good in the ears of those who have not been really trained or don't have the mind that is critical to examine them. They might sound good, or they might seem to prove something that they don't actually prove. For example, let's take the following argument, right? Premise number one, that people with red hair have bad tempers. Now, that's a universal set. It's saying something about everybody with red hair. Premise number two, Darren has red hair. Now, that is a particular, right? So it's talking about a particular member of that category of people who have red hair. The conclusion then would be Darren has a bad temper. Now, when we look at this argument, particularly if you have red hair, you might find this argument rather offensive. However, there is a problem with it, but the problem is not with the form of the argument. The argument is an entirely valid argument if, in fact, people with red hair have bad tempers, and if, in fact, Darren actually has red hair, then it stands to reason that Darren has a bad temper. The problem is not with the form of the argument. The problem in this case is with the truthfulness of the premise, right? Premise number one assumes that people with red hair have bad tempers. That premise is false. In fact, all you really have to do is know one person who has red hair who does not have a bad temper, and that demolishes this entire argument, because premise number one is false. Now, it may be the fact that Darren has a bad temper and that Darren does have red hair, but that doesn't change the fact that this argument is fallacious if it can be shown that somebody, at least one person, who has red hair doesn't have a bad temper. And as the truth of it goes, I do know Darren. He's a friend of mine. He does have red hair, but he's a pretty chill guy. He doesn't have a bad temper. So anyway, this argument has a fallacy. It is an unsound argument. Now, so that's a little bit about logical argumentation. Now, we're going to move on next to the next field of study. A lot more could be said about logic. Indeed, there are entire semester-long courses and even entire degrees devoted to the study of logic. What we are going to say about it here is by no means going to be sufficient if you to know much about it. However, it gives you a little taste about some things that are involved with the study of logic. In addition to that, there's metaphysics. Philosophers study metaphysics. That's the next field of study that we'll look at. And metaphysics can be defined as the study of being and of ultimate reality. The study of being and ultimate reality, the study of existence, the study of what is most fundamental in the universe, this kind of thing. Metaphysics asks and answers, or seeks an answer to the question, what actually is real? What does it mean to exist? What does it mean to be, to become? What does it mean to be in the world, and so forth? Some of the major questions that metaphysics asks and addresses are questions like, does God exist? And if God exists, what is God like? How do people relate to God, and so forth? That is a subcategory of metaphysics known as the philosophy of religion. In addition to that, metaphysics asks the question, what is reality made of? Is it made of matter? Is it a material world only? Is it matter, time, space, energy? Is that all that there is to reality? Or is there something else? Is there a spiritual or mental side, a non-material side to reality? Or is it both of these sort of put together, as in two sides of a coin? One side, spiritual or mental, ideal, some people will use that term. Is it, or on the other side, it is matter. So the two are related. And if that's the case, how do those things relate with each other? How do they affect or impact one another? So what is reality made of? Another question that metaphysics addresses is the question of whether or not human choices are made freely. Are human choices free? Yes, they're free. No, they are not. Is there some way to put those two together? Is there a middle ground? Be careful there, right? The law of the excluded middle. But is there a way in which those two, that yes and no, are compatible? That's a question that we'll look at a little bit later in the semester. But are we really free to choose among options? I mean, the options are there. and we're going to choose one. But when we make our choice, is our choice predetermined by factors that are outside of our control, or is our choice freely made? So those are some questions that metaphysics asks. Now look at these three categories. Does God exist? What is reality made of? Are human choices free? Now, I think that if we are to ask ourselves those questions, I mean, I'm asking them of us right now, but if we were to address those questions, every one of us, if we were to examine ourselves, every one of us has an answer to those questions already in our mind. We already have a position. We already believe in God, or we already don't believe in God, and that's something that we automatically assume. We already assume an answer to that question, and maybe our assumption or what we say is that, well, I don't really know if God exists. I don't have enough evidence. Okay, well, that's fine, but you're going to live one way or the other. Either you're going to live as if God does exist, or you're going to live as if God doesn't exist. And maybe you haven't given much thought to the question, does God exist? But you are currently living as if you already had the answer to that question. The same thing is true with our human choices free. When you got up this morning and you went to eat breakfast, assuming that you did, or maybe you chose not to, you acted as if you had a real choice of whether or not to eat the food. You acted as if you had a real choice of whether or not you would eat Cheerios or scrambled eggs or bacon. Go for bacon. Anyway, I'm just kidding. But you acted as if you had a real choice. You didn't stop to ponder for a moment, is this choice really being freely made? You just automatically assumed an answer to that question and moved on with your life. You didn't ponder it, probably, in all probability. That's what I'm saying when I talked about a worldview earlier. And I said a worldview is the answers that you and I give to the most important questions in life. Well, these are important questions. Does God exist? Well, that's going to have a significant ramification on how you live your life. And it's going to affect you at every level. And it's going to affect how you interact with other people. It's going to affect with what you see with what's wrong with the world today and your solution on how to fix it. And it's going to affect you at every level of your being. And it's one of those questions that sometimes people don't give a lot of thought to. Metaphysics is a study of philosophy that will help us ferret out and understand why we believe what we believe. So metaphysics is another field. So we've got logic, we've got metaphysics. The next field of study is that of epistemology. And epistemology, the study of epistemology, is the study of knowledge and how we know what we know. The study of knowledge and how we know what we know. Now, in epistemology, knowledge is generally defined as true justified belief. This definition comes from Aristotle, and it's a very good working definition that generally people can agree on when they're getting into epistemology. Knowledge is true justified belief. Now, what does it mean to say that knowledge is true justified belief? Well, in order to have knowledge, or in order to say that you have knowledge, you have to believe something to be true. You have to believe it. You can't doubt it and say that I know it, right? It has to be a belief that you're firmly, or that you're at least somewhat convinced of. So in order to qualify as knowledge, it has to be a belief. But here's the thing. Lots of people believe a lot of things that just manifestly cannot count for knowledge because they're not true, right? They cannot count for knowledge because they simply are not true. So in order for it to count as knowledge, not only do you have to believe it, but it also has to be true. It has to be something that corresponds with reality. So it has to be a true belief in order for it to count as knowledge. And it can't be something that is false, because you can't know non-truths. Now, it's possible to know the truth of a myth. For example, I could say, I know that unicorns are horses with a horn, with one horn in the middle of their forehead, and they're magical creatures, okay? Well, I could know that that's what a unicorn is, but my knowledge is not related to the actual world we live in. My knowledge is related to the myth of this magical creature with one horn and that looks like a horse. So I would have knowledge of a myth, and it would be true knowledge of the myth, but it wouldn't be knowledge of the world in terms of I don't think that unicorns actually exist. So in order for it to count for knowledge, it has to be a belief and it has to be true. But there's also one more thing that has to be characteristic of it. We have to be justified in holding that true belief. We can't say, for example, what if I were to say, if you and I were to meet in the hall and I were to say, hey, guess what? I know that my sister-in-law who lives in Chicago is pregnant, and you might say to me, maybe you know her, maybe you're friends on Facebook or something, and you just happened to see that this morning that she had posted a post that was announcing the fact that she was pregnant, and she was all excited about it, and so you knew that what I just said was true, right? So I told you, I said, guess what? I know my sister-in-law who lives in Chicago is pregnant. And you're like, man, that's fantastic. That's great. How did you find out about it? And I would say, well, I had this dream last night that she was pregnant, and so therefore I know that she's pregnant. Now, stop the train for just a minute. I didn't say that I talked to her on the phone. She didn't announce this to me. Nobody that knew both of us told me about this. I didn't see it on social media. There was nothing. There was nothing that would have clued me into that. The only way that I came by this belief, which by the way happened to be true, was that I had a dream about it. Now, I might have a belief, and that belief might correspond to the truth of what's going on in the world today. It might be real. But I cannot say that I had knowledge of it because I am not justified on the basis of simply having had a dream about it to believe that it's true. So my knowledge I would not have knowledge at that point because my knowledge would not have been justified. So with that in mind, so knowledge equals true justified belief. With that in mind, there are several different approaches to epistemology, ways in which we can know what we know that people have emphasized, and there's actually more than what we'll see here in a second. But a few of them. The first one is skepticism. And skepticism says basically that genuine knowledge is not actually possible. Genuine knowledge is not actually possible, to which I would ask, do you know that to be true? Do you know that genuine knowledge is not possible? Because if you know that genuine knowledge is not possible, that means that you know something, right? So on a surface level, the skeptic's claim that genuine knowledge is not possible seems to be almost self-refuting. Maybe not almost self-refuting, it actually is self-refuting. However, let's not be so fast because let's examine what they're actually saying. You see, the skeptic says that genuine knowledge is not possible, and the reason for that is the skeptic would say you can have a belief about something that it's true. And you know what? Your belief might actually be true. It might actually correspond with reality. However, we are never really justified in saying that we have reached the conclusion on something because there's always the open question where we could get more information and we could find out later that what we first believed to be true was not. So we're never really justified in saying that we have all knowledge, that we have knowledge, because it's always possible that we might learn something new or more later that would cancel out what we thought we knew. So there's skepticism. Okay, we'll dig more into that as we get to it. There's rationalism. And rationalism basically says that reason is the best source of knowledge. Reason, just pure reason alone, with no sort of appeal to one's empirical senses or sense experience. So reason are those things that we can come to knowledge of without having to invoke our empirical senses. For example, the founder of modern rationalism, a guy by the name of René Descartes, said, "I think, therefore I am." And a lot of times people have heard of that phrase before, right? I think, therefore I am. What was he saying then? Well, you see, Descartes he wanted to find a rock bottom certainty of knowledge of something. And in order to do that, what he had to do first was he had to doubt everything that he could. And he said that as soon as I find something that I cannot possibly doubt, I will build the entire edifice of my knowledge on the basis of that one thing that I cannot doubt. And so he sets off on his quest to find true knowledge. He says, "Can I doubt the fact that I'm sitting in this room right now? Yes, I can doubt that. I could be having a dream right now. I've had plenty of dreams where I thought that I was there, but I really wasn't." He says, "Okay, so I can doubt that. Let me think. Can I doubt that I'm inside my body right now? That seems pretty apparent. It seems that it's sort of immediately evident that I am here in my body. But then again, it's possible that I could be having this delusion of being in this body and being when I look in the mirror, seeing that face. It's possible that I could be having a delusion right now and maybe being fed some sort of delusion by an evil demon or something like that. It's possible that I am not actually in this body. Maybe I'm hooked up to the Matrix, something like that." He didn't say the Matrix, but that's more modern. He says, "Wait a second. One thing I can't doubt is the fact that I'm actually doubting. In order to doubt, I have to think. In order to think, I have to exist. Therefore, I'm thinking, I'm doubting, I'm thinking, I think, therefore I exist. I have to exist. Now, I may not exist in this body. I may not exist in this room. I may not exist in this world that I see around me. But one thing I do know is that somewhere, somehow, I exist. And I know this because I'm thinking about it." Now, if you look at what he's just said there, notice that Descartes did not appeal to anything outside. He didn't appeal to his senses. He didn't appeal to his experience. What he appealed to was the logical necessity of his own existence if he was the one that is actually thinking. And he says, "Yeah, I'm thinking. That's what's going on here. That's the process that's taking place. I think, therefore I exist. I think, therefore I am." So that was reached purely on the basis of reason. He didn't take a survey. He didn't pinch himself to see if he exists. He didn't ask somebody to tell him about himself. He didn't look in the mirror. He didn't do any of that. He just simply reasoned. He reached the conclusion of his own existence on the basis of reason and reason alone. That's what rationalism is. It's the idea that reason is the best source of knowledge that we have. Now, the next version of epistemology, or the next opinion that people have, is that of empiricism. And empiricism is the idea that sense experience is the best source of knowledge for people. Sense experience is the best source of knowledge. Sense experience being the ability to see, hear, taste, touch, smell, the five senses, and then our mind recording those senses and what we experience through those senses. That is empiricism. Empiricism is the notion that we are born with, and our minds are like a blank slate. And experience, as we grow and as we learn, experience writes on the tablet of our mind, and our mind records these things. Our mind puts them together so that we can make some sense of the world, and it's through sense experience that we know all the things that we know. And then there's the idea of revelation. So we come to know things through reason. We come to know things through our sense experience. We also come to know things when people teach us those things. Revelation. Revelation says the only way to know with certainty is for knowledge to be revealed to us, or one source of knowledge is through people who reveal truth to us. Now, revelation can take form in many different ways. For example, when I was in middle school or high school, I did not figure out algebra for myself. I don't know if you did. I don't know if you have the kind of mind that would be able to do that sort of thing, but I don't. And so I had to have somebody who knew algebra, who was familiar with it, to teach it to me in order for me to learn. So algebra was revealed to me. And so there's this sense in which a lot of what we learn is actually taught to us by others. That is revelation. But there's also another form, there's also another form in which revelation might take. and that is what is known as divine revelation. Now, this form of revelation is revelation where God, who is all-knowing, in some way, shape, or form, reveals truth to people who are not all-knowing. I mean, let's face it, human beings, even if you combine the collective intelligences of all human beings across the globe, we don't know everything that there is to know. We're not omniscient. And so we're always needing to learn things. That's why we go to school. That's why we do science, we do investigations, we do experimentation, basically so that we can come to know the things that we need to know. But God, by definition, knows all things. He's omniscient. And the omniscient God, divine revelation, is when the omniscient God condescends or comes down to human beings and then some way, shape, or form reveals truth to them. Either truth about the world, truth about what's wrong and right, truth about God himself, or whatever. So there's the aspect of revelation of individuals, human beings talking to one another about and revealing truth and teaching one another. There's also the aspect of divine revelation, or the consideration of divine revelation, where the only way that we can know for certain is if we have revelation from God, who is all-knowing, and then we can base our knowledge off of that knowledge. So that is revelation. All right. Now the last, so that's really epistemology, the study of knowledge, how we know what we know, or can we even know anything? Now the last field that philosophers study is a field known as axiology. And by the way, axiology, the various fields, the basic categories, metaphysics, epistemology, logic, axiology, those are basic categories. Underneath those, there can be subcategories as well. And underneath axiology, there are subcategories. But axiology is the study of value, basically. The study of value. And under axiology, some subcategories of axiology are, number one, aesthetics, the study of beauty. And number two, ethics, the study of moral value, right? So there's the study of beauty and the study of moral value, aesthetics and ethics. Now, we are, in this particular class, are not going to get too much into the question of aesthetics. I find that the study of that field has fallen out of favor, fallen out of popularity, but the study of ethics is very much in vogue in our culture, particularly as technology and specifically medical technology, biotechnology advance. The field of ethics is exploded. It's blown up. There are people who want to take ethics classes and things like that and study the field. So aesthetics and ethics. Aesthetics, the study of beauty. Ethics, the study of moral value. And both of those questions of axiology, whether what is true, what is beautiful, versus what is good and bad. Both of those studies in axiology have the same main question at heart here. Both of them have addressed the question of whether or not value is found in an objective sense, or value is found only in a subjective sense. So what we mean by that, if something is objective, that means it exists in the world outside of your mind, at least for the purposes of this question. If something is objective, that means that it exists as true outside of your mind, that there is a trueness that transcends your knowledge of it or your opinion of it. When it's subjective, that means that it's simply your opinion, something that you believe to be true, something that you believe to be right, or you believe to be beautiful. So, for example, in the field of aesthetics, somebody might say, well, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Well, it's certainly true that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but is beauty only in the eye of the beholder? Or is there a universal objective standard of beauty against which things can be judged as objectively beautiful and not just subjectively beautiful? The same thing goes with ethics. Is something good or bad simply because it's what you like or dislike? Now, that would be a subjective approach to ethics. Whereas a more objective approach to ethics would ask, is something universally good or bad for everybody of all times, regardless of their opinion about it? So those are some major questions at the core the study of axiology, the question of objectivity versus subjectivity. And we'll see that more as we get there. There's plenty more to talk about under the field of ethics. And we'll see that as we get to that point. But anyway, this concludes our talk on this introduction to philosophy. This concludes our look at some of the things that philosophers study. For the remainder of the semester, we'll be digging a little bit deeper into each one of these sections. Make sure that you check the syllabus, because the reading in this particular class does jump around from one chapter to the next. It doesn't follow necessarily in a chronological order. And then we will see you on the next video. All right, have a great day.